talk today is just a little bit about raising our vibration with the idea of the yamas. So maybe to give context for those of you that might be visiting or maybe unfamiliar with this comes from the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And Patanjali is this wonderful teacher. We don't know quite much about him, but one of the things that we do know is that he created two systems of yoga. One is called Kriya Yoga, and it's about 3 steps for purifying specifically the afflictions. And then he gives us Ashtanga Yoga, which is an 8-step approach to raising our vibrations so that we can see the truth, we can see our truest self, and maybe reach a state of deep understanding of who we are and why we're here. So the first rung of this 8-step approach is called the yamas. And it's traditionally described as something that we want to work in restraining. So we use certain restraints called the yamas that help us to possibly restrain from a lower nature. But I try to think of the yamas more of like a tuning fork. I think if we look at these 5 steps that are underneath the yamas, each one of them, if we are working them consciously, it's to raise our vibration. Because if we look at our biology and we look at our mind, we can say that, and we look at the world around us, we can say that many people in the world are operating at what we might call a low frequency. And I know that sounds a little woo-woo-y. So if you kind of get like, well, I don't know, she's talking about vibrations and all of that, then maybe think of it as the yamas are transformative. They are ways for us to lift our consciousness or lift our awareness or just be better people. So if we look at the opposite of what Patanjali shares with us, which are these 5 yamas, ahimsa, satya, asteya, brahmacharya, and aparigraha. We look at what they're the cure for, or what they're hopefully helping us to lift up out of. And that's because our nature, our biology of our body and mind, is usually, when we're starting our evolutionary journey, is low. So we might say that if you look around the world at animals, most of them are in a sort of a volatile state, meaning that they're in a constant state of trying to be at some kind of jockeying for a higher ranking. And so I would say if you look around the world at most of us humans, we may be doing the same thing, which is that we're in this constant state of volatile war. In fact, if you look around, we're at war now. I mean, we have never left Afghanistan. We've never really left fully in some of the other countries. And I think maybe even according to the news a week ago, there was even some talk of positioning ourselves in the Middle East. So it's this conflict, it's this constant pushing that is a low vibration. If we look at another volatile thing that we do to ourselves is we're really good at poisoning ourselves, which is volatile. We poison ourselves with food. We poison ourselves with sugar. We poison ourselves with thoughts. We watch sometimes volatile movies that impress a sort of a violence within us. And that keeps us in this perpetual state of low vibration. So the cure, the tuning fork that we want to use is ahimsa. And what that does is it helps to lift our vibration. And Patanjali knew this. He said, if you want to wake up and remember who you are, if you want to be at peace with yourself, if you want to find this inner place of happiness, then practice ahimsa. Practice being non-harming to yourself and non-harming to others. So I put down here, we might even say that we might even harm our world that we live in. I put a little note down here, don't forget the earth. So we're not so good at also taking good care of the earth itself. Sometimes we pollute the waters, we pollute the air, all in the name of maybe modernization. So everything that we can do to put less harm on others, the world that we live in, and to ourselves is a wonderful way to lift ourselves from that low nature that we all may start in. Maybe not everybody in the same life, but we do know that there are people in the world, maybe even close to you, that are operating at a little slightly lower vibration. They're not bad people. They're just operating in a different mindset. So the next Yama in the subcategory is called Satya. And it's because we introduced this concept because Patanjali is sharing possibly with us that our tendency is to be untruthful. But I actually turn it around and say it's actually sometimes deceit. We're actually deceitful by nature as human beings. Not all of us. Now, some of us have cultivated less deceit, but I think of it as somewhere along the line in our human evolution, we might have maybe begun to think that if I had a thought about you or I said something untruthful to you, that you wouldn't know I was lying. There was something maybe in our DNA that said if I have a thought and said something, that you would know if that was not true. But someone told me one time that there was a movie out there called The Invention of Lying. I don't know, I never saw the movie, but I liked the title. And it's because somewhere along the line, we learned that we could lie and the other person wouldn't know. In other words, I could say, oh my gosh, I love your shirt, but not really. But I wouldn't say that. And then I realized that they didn't know. And I was clever. I was like, I could tell them all kinds of falsehoods and they wouldn't know. Now, on the good flip side of lying, we've had fiction books written. Because fiction and telling stories is lying. It's embellishing something. It's exaggerating something. And we can all laugh and enjoy a made-up story, because that's kind of being untruthful. But it's a good way. It's something that's creative. But then there's the opposite, which is actually deceiving, where we intentionally, unconsciously deceive not only ourselves, but others. And this is where we are operating at that low vibration. So when we start to tell the truth, when we seek the truth, then we lift our vibration. Now, this starts to get into a little bit of where we have to use discernment, because I tell the story often about a journey that I made with my family. My mom and my dad and my younger sister and I were traveling back from my grandparents' house. And my father and I never had a really great relationship. I mean, it was always conflicting. I would say blue and he would say black. I would say up and he would say down. It was just always like this little bit of push-pull with he and I. Well, as we were traveling along in the car, my sister and my mother were in the back and they were asleep. And my father and I were making kind of small talk because we didn't have really much to talk about. But just let me give you some context. I had been in California and had been doing some deep work with my own personal sort of issues and things of personal growth. So here I was in the car with my father, and he, out of the blue, says, "You know, I was a great father, wasn't I?" So I remember gripping the steering wheel because I was driving, and I was thinking to myself, well, that's not what I remember. I remember a lot of conflict. I remember a lot of pain, and it wasn't intentional, but it was a lot of difficulty that I was living with and struggling with. And so I didn't say anything. I said, And he said, "You know, I was always there for you." Yeah. And then I think he said one other thing where then all of a sudden, I just turned to him in a volatile way and I said, "You were not a good father. You were a terrible father." And I don't even know where that came from. And that was himsa. That was not a himsa. I was going for the jugular. But I remember him then justifying. I said, "You weren't a good father." And then I gave a couple of reasons why. And then he got very quiet. And then he said a few things like, "Well, no, I don't remember it that way." And I said, "Well, I do." And then I remember him getting very quiet and looking out the window. And we didn't speak for the next hour or two. Well, so I get home and then I spend some time and we don't really talk about it. And I go back to California. I'm learning yoga to deal with my stress. And what I came up with in one of my meditations is that there's a really fine line of who was telling the truth. Was I telling the truth? Was he telling the truth? Hard to know. It requires a lot of discernment to try to sort that out. And what I found is that the truth, neither one of us was speaking it. We were speaking our truth, which is very different from the truth. So my adage after that was, I don't have the truth and you don't have the truth. The truth lies in the middle. We have to each let go of a little bit of what we think is true in order to get to the truth. So it was a very personal breakthrough for me in this idea of Satya. Satya gets a little ambiguous with the idea of truth, because sometimes we really think we're holding on to it. Like, I'm telling the truth. This is how I see it. But instead, I think it would be good for us to think of, this is my truth. I don't like your shirt. I'm just giving you my truth, not the truth. But sometimes when we hear people say that, we're like, "Oh, that dress, I don't really like that dress. I mean, I'm just telling you the truth, but that's not the truth. That's their truth." And we have to be conscientious. Have to use a little art of discernment to try to really practice lifting our vibration to true Satya. So the next one is asteya, and it translates as non-stealing. And that's because in our human nature, our lowest vibration, our tendency is to take from others. Oh, we take all kinds of things. We might take, because when I first learned this, I always thought, but I don't steal pens from my office. So I'm clear, check. I've got that one down. But actually, asteya is also another deep level, because if our tendency is to take, it's to be conscientious of how we take. Maybe the resources from the earth. How many times do we leave the lights on? That's taking what doesn't belong. So not necessarily to us, but just overtaking. Or we might take someone's energy, or we might take energy in general. I used to say at the studio, people used to come in, they're like, "Oh, so we just want to find out if you take credit cards." And I'd say, "Oh, yeah." Mm-hmm. And he said, "Well, I'd love to work with you on giving you a new rate." And I said, "I so appreciate that, but we just changed our credit card company, and I appreciate it." And they'd say, "Well, if you only have about 10 minutes. I said, "No, actually, I don't have 10 minutes. I'm so sorry. I so appreciate you coming in. And thank you for your, just thank you for your time and your interest." And they would say, "But now if you want to just take my card," and they would just keep going. And finally, I'd have to just be the bitch. I would say, "Look, I'm just telling you, now you're starting to take my energy. You're starting to take my time. So now I'm going to have to say, please, I'm so sorry. I cannot do that. please leave. I mean, after 10 minutes. And I think, oh my gosh, they just wasted 10 minutes of my time debating over something, because just people sometimes are a little pushy. And so that can be also kind of like a theft. Someone's taking your time, your energy. But the main one that I want to speak of when it talks about taking is a form of taking that we don't even realize, and that is idle gossip. So sometimes we don't realize it, but we can actually take someone's persona. We can take their own wonderful energy by gossip, idle gossip. Just saying something small. So the way that I give it in an analogy is, imagine that Betty and Sally are good friends. And Sally has had an altercation with somebody at work named John. So she starts to sort of tell Betty, oh my God, this guy John, he's so awful. You know, he's this, he's that. He's lazy. He's a terrible colleague. And, you know, he's just a downer to be around. And of course, Betty is taking all of this in from Sally and, you know, is commiserating with her for having to deal with such an awful person. And maybe weeks go by where Sally is constantly talking to Betty about this terrible person, John. But one day, Betty goes off to some retreat, yoga retreat. And she meets a fella there that seems to be a really nice guy. And his name is John. So it ends up that Betty says something along the lines of, John, oh, where do you work? And he says, such and such place. I have a friend that works there. Her name is Sally. Oh, yeah, I work with Sally. Now, already Betty is going to have a predisposed idea about John. She's been fed all this information about him. So John never gets to even maybe possibly enjoying Betty's company, because Betty has already put I already know what John's like. He's this, and he's lazy, and he's unkind, because he's gotten all this information from Sally. So this is the art of stealing someone's persona through gossip. And we don't even think of it that way. We just think of it as idle, like, oh, I work with somebody and they're a terrible person, and we say all these things, and we don't realize where that information is expanding to, how it's connecting. So we try to monitor what we say by practicing asteya, by trying to not steal or to not take what doesn't belong to us. So I'll end with another sort of idea of taking that we tend to be in a low vibration category, and that is, one time I was watching the TV show Planet Earth, and it was showing a group of chimpanzees, and they were kind of moving through the woods, and then the camera pans up to a fruit tree a little further away, and another group of chimpanzees are up there. And somehow or another, the chimpanzees on the ground are like, I want that fruit in that tree. Yeah, and I'll do anything they have no consciousness that maybe I shouldn't do that. Maybe I should think about not eating that fruit today. Maybe I should let them have it. But instead, they attack the tree, and then it's mayhem. It's pretty gruesome. I had to cover my eyes. I was like, oh my God, this is Planet Earth. There's a lot of baby chimps running, flying in the air. So all this is to say is that sometimes taking what doesn't belong to us is that root-based need that we don't even realize that's in us. But as we lift our vibration through the practice of asteya, we start to maybe have less and less of those tendencies. So the next one is brahmacharya. Now, when I'm teaching and teacher training, sometimes I can go off on an interesting slant in brahmacharya. But let me just share a little bit, because it in many ways, many translate it as renunciation. But I don't wear orange. So I have to figure out other ways to renounce. But if we look at the translation of the word, Brahma means divine or God, and Acharya translates, or I've heard it translated as to be more like or to emulate in some way. So we're trying to emulate the divine. And one way that the divine is so powerful is that it's conscious. And it's consciously creating. And so to be brahmacharya would be to think about the endeavors of creating consciously. And when I look out into the world, most of us, including myself, we are unconsciously creating all the time. We unconsciously create dramas and issues and problems. We may unconsciously create something that we have to later fix. We may unconsciously create or procreate. I read a study that in the world, almost 80% of all children born are born from unconsciousness. They were the oops. So that means there's a lot of unconscious creating going on. So specifically, we might say that brahmacharya might mean sexual restraint. But I would say that it's a waste. Brahmacharya is the absence of conscious creation. It's a waste of our creative energy. So if there's anything that we could possibly lift our vibration, it would be to really think about what it is that we're putting out into the world. Our work, our thoughts, our intentions. And when they come from a place of consciousness, they begin to produce wonderful fruit. And when they come from unconsciousness, we don't know what we're going to get. It could be a problem, or it could just be we're lucky. So sometimes when I'm teaching at younger people that are engaged still in sexual activities a lot, and they're dabbling in that, sometimes I translate or I share a small story that I heard in Chennai, India at the Yoga Vidalayam there, or the Yoga Mandiram of Krishnamacharya, Desikachar's ashram. And we weren't able to see Desikachar right away on my first visit there, and so we got one of his senior disciples. And I don't know why he decided to talk about brahmacharya, but I remember us sitting there, and he was maybe sharing a little bit of the act of sexual restraint, just sort of the idea of restraining in the act of brahmacharya. And something that he said, something along the lines of that each encounter that we have in the field of sexual intercourse is a binding. What man brings together, no man, or what God brings together, no man can pull it asunder. So what I gathered from that is that each encounter we have has a karmatic connection, and that whatever we do karmatically in terms of binding energy, we're bound to it for eternity. And of course, as a young person back on my first trip to India, I was like, oh, wow. 1, 2. I was trying to think back of all the unconscious sort of connections I had made that I was karmatically bound to. Bummer. So for the young people, I usually say, before you have sort of sexual interactions with somebody, maybe really look at that person and say, do I want to be bound to them for eternity? It just adds, and then they're just looking at you like, what? So to lift our vibration, we practice brahmacharya as a tuning fork that lifts us from our lower tendencies to just engage in wasteful creative energy. Because that's really what it is. I mean, when you think about sexual interactions, there's the creation of something from that. And so we want to just be mindful of what it is. And if we maybe aren't having sex, let's think about what creative energy we would like to put out into the world. What would we like to manifest? What would we like to create? And that way we're directing that creative energy towards some really wonderful endeavor. Yeah? And so the last one is on aparigraha. This translates as non-greed. And that's because our tendency as low vibrating human beings is to be greedy, to take more than what we need. And of course, we all know that when we go to the all you can eat buffet, we're always like, I'm going to get my money's worth. I'm going back for 12 plates, whether I need it or not. So there's a built-in mechanism that we look out and we say, I'm going to take more than what I need. And so that's that grasping, that clinging that there's not enough, that there's some lack, that we are somehow or another, there's not enough to go around. And so we reach out and try to grasp what we can instead of trusting that the universe has our back. So the practice of this really starts to lift us out of that there is plenty. There is plenty to go around. I think the quote that I read from Gandhi, was it today? That there is plenty for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. Yeah, was that it today? Mm-hmm. Oh, this is something that we see a lot in just the evolution of mankind. I would say I have a little house that was built in 1958. And the closets are kind of tiny because not many people had that much clothes. I mean, you had a man had maybe one or two suits, and a woman had maybe her Sunday dress and maybe a couple of other dresses for the day, or a little apron that she wore every day to kind of protect the dress. So all the closets are like three feet. And then I watch sometimes House Hunters. It's my indulgence, but there's no violence. But I see sometimes in the House Hunters, today's houses, a woman walks into the master bedroom and they said, and look, a walk-in closet. Yeah, and so they open up the door and the woman walks in and she said, this is just enough for all my stuff. I don't know where you're going to put yours. And I think, oh my gosh, how much stuff do you have? So it's like shoes and clothes, and it's just like, so that we don't think of greed as taking buying more shoes or clothes, but there's some innate quality in us that is trying to maybe stockpile shoes or clothes that make us feel good. So there's this sense that we're always reaching out and we're grasping, we're trying to hoard or accumulate or possess things. And Patanjali is just like, this is going to create great suffering. It keeps you in that low vibration all the time. So we try to rise above it by applying the little tuning fork that lifts us into understanding that there is plenty. There is always enough. Yeah? So I put down here just a little something, a little note to myself. So these yamas, when we utilize them or incorporate them, have the capacity to lift us out of our lower tendencies and begin to vibrate at a frequency of Om. Now that's Patanjali shares with us in Book 1, Sutra 27, this idea of Om as a vibration that lifts us. So if we're operating down in a low vibration, if God walked through the door, we might not even notice. We might not see because we haven't risen to a state of connection. So it's like God is on the station GOD 0.1 and we're over in 92.8 and the frequencies don't even connect, so we're not getting the signal. So the yamas help us to lift our vibrations so that we can resonate. why would we even enjoy heaven if we can't vibrate in a heavenly way on this earth, right? So we're trying to lift our vibration so that when we get experience, reach whatever, however you want to think of some destination, whether it's an inner destination or an outer destination, we have to experience that vibration here. We have to resonate, get our radio tuned to that frequency. Otherwise, it's just static. Yeah? So if you don't believe in vibration and frequency, then try to think that you're trying to evolve. Yeah? So we're trying to lift ourselves out of our animal-based nature because we all have it within us. It's just part of our biology and our mind. We may think we're special, but we have the same sort of nervous system as a rat. So we're in the same mindset in our first introduction into a human body. We are pretty much in that vibration of the rat. And we're just walking around saying, I gotta, eat or be eaten. And I've got to deceive and try to scoop my way through in some way. Or I have to take whatever I can in order to survive. I have to hoard food when I can get it. And I have to hump like crazy to make more rats. So there's no consciousness to it. It's just running around, experiencing, but not really getting anywhere. So slowly but surely, we're trying to lift our own vibration to move out of that low nature tendency. And Patanjali's teachings are so wonderful because as we began to work, as Swami Satchidananda said in the film, our foundation, when we start to lift that, we start to feel that we're making some strides in our evolution. We're starting to feel lighter, calmer, more peaceful, less agitated, less restless, yeah? So in book 2 of the Yoga Sutras, verse, I think 47, it says, by lessening the natural tendency of restlessness. So our tendency is restless. And we're trying to calm that so that we can experience a higher level, a more higher way of being, a more conscious way of being. That's the power of the yamas.